Okay, so welcome back to All-Star Image Critique with Frans Lanting. This is the second in the series of two critique sessions. Last week we specialized on wildlife. This week we're specializing on landscape. We did have more landscape submissions put in this time than we did wildlife. We gave that horde of images over to Frans and his team to cull it down to 30. Frans is going to be doing a comprehensive critique, about 2 minutes each for each image. I got some interesting feedback from last week. And sometimes Frans picked an almost perfect photograph and really didn't have much to critique it. So if you do feel like you got shorted on the critique, this is actually a good thing. That means that you did everything right, and all Frans could do is say that it was great. Other images he wants to work a little bit more with, and he's got his amazing team, Ross, who's going to be running some Adobe Lightroom at the instructions of Frans. Also want to thank Talia, who's in the office, who helped us get these submissions over. And I would be remiss to not also thank Fred, Kelsey, and the tireless B&H team that is also producing this as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Frans. Frans, I'm not going to give you a big intro and big bio like I did last time, because I think everybody knows you at this point. So take it away, Frans. Thank you so much.
All right, good morning or good evening to everyone who's joining us for this image review. I'm curious where you're all chiming in from, so please contribute your comments and your questions via the chat room. But I'm going to focus on looking at the images you submitted. And there were a lot of interesting ones, and it was not easy to cull them down to 30. So apologies if your image wasn't chosen. And I pick images that are interesting to review and to make them educational for everybody else. If a picture is perfect, there's not much that I can say except kudos and do it again. So we're going to have to go fast in this image review because with 30 images for an hour, there's only 2 minutes. So I'm going to focus primarily on what I think the photographer was trying to do when he or she was looking at a scene. And I often find that the vision can be more clearly expressed if we do some quick cropping. Now, I have Ross here by my side. Ross can come in here.
Hi everyone.
Yeah, Ross works with me here in the studio, and we work very closely together on improving images that I take back from the field. I'm not perfect either, and we can all benefit from all the capabilities in Adobe Lightroom and in Photoshop to make our images look better. But we're going to have to go fast, and apologies if I make some judgments that you don't agree with. And of course, if you would like to go at a more leisurely pace, come and join us for a workshop where we can take more time and we can stretch out. But shall we go? And we'll start the image review right now. But a few more comments before we look at the first image. I would like to dedicate this session to the great Bruno Barbet, a Magnum photographer who passed away in France. And he was a real master, and I learned a lot from looking at his photographs. So this is to the memory of Bruno, and all the best wishes to his family. So as soon as Ross is behind the controls, we can start the image review, which will be focused on landscape photography. But I saw some interesting images that show people in there as well. And that is really what I'm going to stress too, is that landscape photography in the purest sense is not just about the natural scene. Landscape photography can be practiced in urban settings. It can involve people, it can involve animals. And whenever you can create those kind of combinations, you'll find that your images become more dynamic. Here's the first image, and I just had a quick glance at the comments. It's great to see so many friends there who are monitoring this session, so thank you for joining us. But let's move on to the first image here. This looks like it's a scene made somewhere in the forest of the East Coast, and where does my eye go to? It goes to that swirl of water in the middle. it goes to the waterfall in the background, and it goes to the rocks in the foreground that are pointing to these elements in the middle ground and the background. And I would like to focus the composition more clearly on those three elements. The image was delivered to us in a square crop, but I think we can make it more dynamic if we crop in from both sides. So Ross, let's come in from the left and let's come in from the right. And then I think we can more clearly express what the photographer was seeing, but didn't crop in on the essential elements. Now let's lock this in. What do you think? Are we making the image better? Maybe we can shift it a little bit to the right, because I'm still seeing a little bit of the tree branches there. And if we do that, now we have a really dynamic landscape. You see how all these lines from the foreground are meeting in the middle, and then the swirl of water points back to the water in the background. Now we could pull out a little bit more detail at the cliff, from the cliff in the background. So we do that by improving shadow detail. And if we do that, we're going to fill the frame instead of looking at darkness in the back. Now there's even more eye candy to show in the background. We can probably improve the whites a little bit as well. So we move the white slider to the right. And of course we could do a lot more, but I think this is just a quick fix. But now let's do the quick before and after. Go back to the original. Anyway, I hope you get the point. Let's go to the second image. And kudos to the maker. This is a nice spot. I'd love to hang out there sometime myself. So this is a very different scene. This looks like it's a footpath along a canal. Not exactly sure what the location was, but that doesn't matter, because if you live in urban areas, you can find these situations not so close from dense metropolitan built-up areas. This is a contemplative scene here. And when I think of contemplation, then I want to emphasize everything that goes along with that feeling. It's a really nice line of that footpath or that bike path that leads us into the image, but it's a little bit too prominent in the lower left corner. So I would consider cropping in from the bottom a little bit. And Ross, can you make that happen? Generally, when we go from a standard aspect ratio to more of a panoramic view, that leads to a more contemplative approach to showing landscape. So now let's lock that in. See, it looks a little bit more restful. And then if we tone down the highlights in the foreground in that path a little bit, to make them blend a little bit more with the neutral tones in the middle of the path, then our eye is going to go more towards the center of the view. And what I really like about the image is that the lightness is in the middle, or actually in the far distance there, and that draws our eyes in. I do see maybe some other things on the right hand side that could get cropped out as well. A few details. It looks like there's some signposts there, but we're not going to worry about that. Let's look at the image overall. Do you like what you're seeing? I do. So we could go much further. Let's try, well, now that I'm looking at it, let's crop in from the right, the middle right, and see if we can get rid of some of these signposts there. Yeah, come in a little bit more, and a little bit more. Okay, now let's lock it in. Now we have a natural scene, and I think this harmonizes a little bit better from the right and to the left. The next thing we could do is we start to look at the colors. Can we separate the colors a little bit more? I see some browns and greens and yellows, but we're going to have to save that for another rainy day. The blues too look really beautiful. There's a lot of eye candy here, and this image can be processed in a more contrasty way, or we can keep it very soft. This is where things become very subjective. But kudos to the maker of this. Nice image. Next one, please. Wow, I think we would all like to be there someday, or if you've been there, you think of an opportunity to go back. This is obviously Antarctica. There's only one place on Earth that quite looks like that. You could say it could be the Arctic, but the icebergs in the Antarctic are different from the ones in the Antarctic. Now, if you've been down there, you know the experience. You go out in a Zodiac and then you cruise along the iceberg, and you get all these up close views of that magnificent landscape. What the photographer did in this case was look over the shoulders of the participants, and that leads you into the scene. But could we have done a little bit more in this case? Well, I think so. If we crop in from the right, then we can emphasize where the most dynamic part of the scene is, which is that towering iceberg that is about to break apart, and we turn this into more of a square crop. Now let's leave the upper part alone. Okay, let's take a look at it now. I think now we're looking more clearly at the two things that are essential here. It is that amazing iceberg and the people looking at it. However, I would also like to suggest to the maker of the photograph, if he or she could ever go back, is to pull back a little bit and to see if there's another vantage point possible to make the Zodiac and the people in it smaller in relationship to the iceberg, because this is a grand scene, and in a way the people in the foreground are blocking the view towards the iceberg. Now, how would you do that? You could back off and use a longer lens. By going away from the people in the Zodiac, you make them smaller relative to the rest of the scene. So think of backing up if you want to create a different relationship between foreground and background. Next image, please. This is another scene from the polar regions, but this time we are in the Arctic. And how do I know that? Well, I recognize the ship. This is a magnificent three-masted schooner that does service for small expedition cruises in the Arctic, and I was lucky to be on that ship. We chartered it a couple of times for cruises along the Greenland coast. There's only one ship quite like that, and I hope that someday we'll be able to charter it again for a similar expedition. So what the maker of this image did right was use the subject, which is clearly that iceberg there, and then combine it with that ship in the background, and it looks like a long exposure was used to blur out the details in the water, and that is very nicely done. I think that what I could see as an improvement is to lighten the things in the upper right a little bit, because everything else is in a high key fashion. So if we kind of lighten things a little bit in the sky and even in the hillside there, then it opens it up, and then we focus more on the balance between the four corners. The other thing that could happen here is we could turn this into a vertical and get rid of that hillside, and then it would become even more of a high key frame. Or let's do this, Ross. Let's now shift the view like this. But now we're losing that sense of space a little bit, so I'm having second thoughts. I would like to get rid of a little bit of that darkness in the upper right, but not turn it into a full vertical. So maybe it needs to become a square crop, which is not something that I do very often, but there is a role for square images. Typically they look very balanced, and I think that might be the right solution here. What do you think? Now we can start playing with color. There's a lot of subdued color here. There's lovely pastel blues and pastel pinks and some yellow as well, and we can separate those quite easily in Lightroom, but I think we're going to have to wait for another time to do that. But this is a lovely image. Kudos to the maker. Now this is an urban scene. So I mentioned earlier that landscapes should not just be focusing on natural scenes. There are plenty of interesting opportunities in our cities. But this looks like it's an interior scene, and it looks like this may have been made in Singapore, where there's some fantastic interior scenes that evoke lush rainforest scenes. So, but what is the image about here? I see some interesting shapes, but is the image about the structure of the building that encompasses that rainforest, or is it about the vegetation? I suggest that we go for the vegetation and that we pull the upper limit of the image down. So Ross, let's pull it in from the center and go all the way down until there's just a hint left in that roof. Okay, now let's lock it in. Now that goes a little bit too far. Come up a little bit more. Okay, now lock it in. Now it's clear that it is an enclosed environment with a hint of the building, and I think this is more true to the scene itself, but where my eyes are really wanting to go is into these lovely tree ferns there, and I think that is where there's a lot of really interesting compositions. So let's not go too far, but Ross, let's just give a hint of what the photographer could do when he or she has a chance to go back there again. So let's lose all references to human structures and let's go in there. I would love to spend a day wandering around in there with a camera on a tripod and a short telephoto lens, or maybe even with a macro lens. So photographer, this is the starting point for your next mission. This looks like another scene that I would love to wander around in sometime myself. It's a fisherman at the edge of a lake, morning mist rising. There's a lot of eye candy here. So I try to analyze the scene and I try to come up for myself with what the image is all about. It's the interaction of a fisherman with a landscape. Could we do any better than what the photographer has done here? I could accept this scene just as it is, but I can't resist the opportunity to come in a little bit tighter, and I'm looking at that morning mist in the background, and I'm looking at that lovely island in the middle, and I would like to see if we can turn this into a square crop as well. So let's get rid of the trees on the right hand side, so we keep the cropping lock open, and now we let's turn this into a real square. So now it's even more open than what the photographer did. What I would do now as well is I would darken the reflections in the water a little bit, because typically reflections need to be a little bit darker than the light in the sky. It looks like the photographer may have done some darkening in the sky, and I want to balance that out. So we could either lighten the sky or darken the water reflections. I go for the latter. So with the neutral grad filter in Lightroom, we can do that very quickly. Now, do you like what you see here? I certainly do. I think this image is now nearly perfect. We can do some more detailed adjustment with color and with contrast, but I think this looks pretty nice. This is another scene I would love to walk into with my own camera sometime. I've never worked with mountain goats in the Canadian Rockies, and I do know that there are places where those mountain goats have become very habituated to people. And I can tell from the body language of that goat that it's not concerned at all about the photographer standing there. And if I pay attention to an animal and it is that relaxed around me, then I say, okay, I can work this situation. This is my starting point. And what I would do in this case is I would, first of all, look at the animal and then see if I can get a little bit closer and then go a little bit lower, because the key ingredients are here. It's the relationship between the mountain goat and the mountains and then that lake. But I see some things that I would rather not see in my composition. Those rocks in the lower center are not really that great to look at, and the rocks in the foreground I would rather not see either. So we can't really do much with this image because the photographer has locked us into a certain vantage point. But I would love to go a little bit to the right. I would get a little bit closer, and I would get a little bit lower. Now we could give you a hint of where that could go. So we take down the image. We see too much sky here, so bring it in from the center. Okay, we turn it into more of a pano view, but this is going in the right direction already. And we come in a little bit closer to the mountain goat on the right, and we bring the sky down even more. Now you're beginning to see more what the possibilities are, but I think this is still just a starting point. So if you have an opportunity to go there, I hope you can keep these principles in mind, and I look forward to seeing the next result. This is another example of a situation that has great ingredients for an interesting image, but the photographer triggered the shutter button a bit too fast or left too quickly. We see this all the time when we are traveling in places, and maybe you're on your way to someplace else and you don't take the time to really work a situation, or you don't think enough about the scene and you think that everything that your eye first latches onto is right. But typically, when you go into a dialogue with yourself about what it is that you are attracted to, it leads you to a clearer view of what you need to focus on, and just as important, what you need to delete from your view. So obviously, the most interesting elements here are the old style windmill and the new generation wind turbines. Now, you could argue that the power line also needs to be part of the picture, but I don't think that that cattle area there is part of the image. That is something very different. So I would like to get rid of that altogether. So Ross, we open the aspect ratio lock, and then we crop in pretty dramatically from the bottom, very slowly until that is out of the picture. We go a little bit further, we go a little bit further still, and now we lock it in. Now it's beginning to look better. I wish that there was a different relationship with that giant turbine on the right, but as it is, we can't move that. So I would like to get a little bit closer to the key ingredients in the center. So we leave the aspect ratio open, and now we're going to pull down from the center and just come in. And we don't have to see all of that wind turbine on the right. Let's get radical here, Ross. Okay, just like this. Now we're talking. I think we can still do quite a bit better, but now we need the photographer to move. So I wish that the photographer could be on site and that we could have a live conversation. Maybe this new universe of virtual image reviews will lead to a new style workshops where I can interact with photographers on location and say, have you thought of going a little bit to the right, sinking through your knees? But let's wait with applying that to some point in the near future. But you can see where this is going. It is really interesting as a concept, but it can be done better. Now we're in a very different situation. I recognize these trees. These are Cecropia trees which grow in the tropical parts of Central and South America. They're really quite photogenic. Lovely shapes. The leaves are quite tall, and the photographer has done a great job of capitalizing on these partially submerged Cecropia trees. Interesting idea to convert this to a black and white. Let's analyze the composition. Here the photographers decided to frame the Cecropias with tree trunk and a reflection on the right, tree trunk and reflection on the right, but the waterline is not quite level, so that's the first thing I would do. And I would also argue that we may not need the tree trunks on the left and on the right because the eye candy is really in the middle. So let's see if we can turn this into a vertical. Let go of the detail on the left and the detail on the right and see if we can make things a little bit more graphic. Okay. Now let's go a little bit to the right. Okay, now. Yeah, a little bit of space on the left. And I think this is actually a more interesting image. And now Ross is leveling the waterline because this needs to be really balanced. It's about the leaves and their reflection in the water, and that needs to be just perfect in terms of their alignment. Now we could crop in a little bit from the top as well, and then we create even more of a harmony between the leaves and their reflection in the water. In terms of development, I think the photographer has done all the things that I would do as well. Lovely gray tones in the middle, beautiful darks. So yes, I like this. Wow, I recognize this landscape too. This looks like Torres del Paine in Patagonia. There's only one place in the world that I know of that looks quite like this, and it's always stormy. It's not just a fantastic landscape, but you can guarantee that there will be storms, that there will be atmospherics, and that there will be snow falling even in midsummer. Be prepared for extreme weather there. So this looks quite dynamic, but there's something about the proportions in this scene that I wish we could express a little bit better. What are my eyes going to? My eyes are going to, the sunlit portions of that cliff face in the middle, the contrast with the shadowy parts of the cliff faces in the foreground, and then there's the swirling clouds in the middle. I wonder if we could turn this into more of a panorama and focus the attention more on what's going on in the middle. So we leave the aspect ratio lock open, and now we crop in from the bottom a little bit, and we crop in from the top without losing the peaks. And we probably need to go a little bit higher up because now I see that snow field in the extreme lower right, and that bothers me a little bit. Okay, now let's lock this in, and I feel we're getting a little bit closer now to the sunlit areas in the middle. And now what can we do next here? Could we consider turning this into a black and white and then play with the gray tones? That is one way to do it. and now we can create a little bit more drama in the clouds in the upper left to create deeper blacks a little bit, not too deep because we really don't want to lose all these lovely grays in the middle. I think we want to see a little bit more drama in the clouds. So is this the best solution? Not so sure. If I go back to the color, then I think it's a toss-up what I would prefer. So Ross has created more drama in the sky now, and now let's have another last look at the color version, which will have the benefit of that additional drama in the sky. Now I think the yellow looks a little bit too exaggerated. Of course, you can't easily go back from changes you made in a black and white conversion back to color, so we need to back off from the color saturation a little bit. I would maybe make the clouds in the color version, a little bit more yellow orange and get away from that lemony color. But you see where this is going. I think the critical decision is to go from the composition as it was delivered to us into more of a panoramic landscape view. An urban scene. I picked this image from the hundreds that were submitted because, let's face it, many of us live in city environments, and especially in the era of COVID, when we can't travel to Patagonia or we can't travel to Antarctica, we have to find our landscape images closer to home. And there are opportunities. Every city has a park. Every city has waterways. So, and I would like to look at all the ingredients that the photographer was playing with in this composition and analyze what is most interesting here. Well, my eyes are drawn towards the trees and to the person in the middle and to the reflections in those water puddles there. What I would like to see less of is that hard, rigid line of the freeway there in the middle. It bifurcates the image in a way that doesn't really harmonize that well with all the other ingredients. So one way in which we could lessen the impact of that is to see if we could turn this into a vertical and reconfigure the relationship. So let's go to a vertical, and this time we can lock in the aspect ratio. So now let's try that. We get rid of that box in the middle because that's another square space, so we go a little bit to the left. Okay, now let's take a look at it. Now what we could do is level that freeway a little bit. We can't get rid of it, so we might as well make the most of it and make it a straight line instead of something that is slightly curvy. Now I think we're doing better with the key ingredients, but I'm still not liking that freeway too much. Where my eyes are really going to is the water reflections. So let's get radical here. The image may not, the file quality may not stand this, but let's get rid of the freeway. Let's bring this crop all the way down to the bottom side. So Ross, let's bring it down to the lower half of the image. Okay, let's do this. And now we go a little bit to the left with the crop. You see where this is going. Let's get rid of that box, which is actually a garbage can. Okay. Now you can see the image begins to fall apart, but now I see some really interesting elements. If this were someone I was walking with on that track, I would say, hey, could you walk backwards and could we do something here together? Or if you're there by yourself, you just wait for a little bit and you wait for another person to pass through there and kind of pre-compose, and then the next pedestrian becomes part of your scene. that is a rock climber. But it is not just any old rock climber. This was a world famous mountaineer, and I recognize his face. This is the inimitable Galen Rowell, who is a colleague and a good friend of mine, and he revolutionized landscape photography in the 1980s and the 1990s. Galen made landscape photography more dynamic. He talked about participatory landscape photography. He put himself in the scenes, and he worked with other people and made them part of his compositions. And I learned so much from him, and he gave so much to other photographers as well. And here he is scaling a rock somewhere, I don't quite know where, but that doesn't matter. What the photographer did really well here, he positioned himself to free up Galen against that rock face, and then of course what makes the image is the light shining onto the photographer's face, and that enables us to identify a little bit more with the photographer as an individual. The only thing that isn't quite right is that the foot is still connected with the peaks in the horizon. So in a situation like this, you have to capture a lot of frames, or you have to work with your subject to optimize the body outline, and that is what Galen would do. He knew exactly how to make somebody's body stretch. It's all about the body outline, where the feet are positioned, where the arms are positioned. So thank you, photographer, for bringing back memories of all these times that I spent with Galen in the field. And if you want to know who Galen was, look for his books and read them, because his writing was just as interesting as his images were. Thank you. Another scene from the poles of the planet. And there's only one place where you can see this, and that is Antarctica. I recognize this scene. I can pretty much tell in which bay along the Antarctic Peninsula this photograph was made, because I've been there myself, and every summer humpback whales come down and they spend the short summers there feasting on krill, and the photographer did a really nice job here of contrasting the immensity of the landscape with the flukes of a whale, and that gave the landscape scale, and it just expresses the enormous quality of the landscapes there. Lovely color, but I think we may be able to express it a little bit better. I would go a little bit further with expressing the blues, and I would probably darken the scene from the top a little bit, grade it a little bit, and then we're beginning to see a bit more of that lovely mauve purple in the middle where the last light is still touching the snowfield, and I would maybe lighten the water just a touch, and that creates a little bit more differentiation between the different layers in this scene. And what this does, we can't go too far, but what this does, it highlights the whales a little bit more. And of course, the magic moment will be when that second whale is also raising its flukes, and that's why you have to expose a lot of frames in a situation like that. So, lovely scene, and I'm looking forward to going back there. In fact, we have a charter planned with a small ship in early 2022 or 2023. I forget now when we're going to do this, but if you're interested in joining me in Antarctica, go to our website and sign up, and we'll let you know when we're going to do that. I love panoramic landscape photography. I do it all the time, and I apply both my DSLRs when I stitch together panos from different frames that are captured in the field, and then we stitch them together in Adobe Lightroom, which is very easy these days. Or I do it very quickly with my iPhone, which gives you the results instantly and on the spot. Or I do it with a small Sony RX4, which is a pocket camera. Now, when you compose, for a panoramic landscape, you have to think very differently than when you are looking through the scene with a DSLR or something equivalent to that. You need to bookend your composition on the left and on the right. And in this case, what I would do is crop in a little bit from the right. These are granaries in the southwest, and I would make that first granary window, the starting point for the composition. And then there's the not that tight, Ross, back up a little bit, but you can shift the whole view to the right now, because we want to crop in a little bit to the left on that old Anasazi cliff dwelling. And now I think, give it a little bit more space on the left. You want to balance out the left and the right hand space, but this is a good application of what I meant by bookending your composition on the left and on the right. And then we can develop the image a bit more. It looks a little bit flat. I would create a little bit more contrast in it, improve the blacks a little bit, and especially improve the middle tones. And there's a lot more interest in the sky that can be treated separately. But that takes more subtle development than we have time for here. All right, let's carry on, because we've got a lot more images to go. And I should speed up a little bit. You can see I get locked into an image, and there's all these things I'd like to do. Let's zero in on what is most interesting here. That is the waterfall. And I don't know what kind of lens the photographer had here, and whether he or she had a chance to apply a longer lens or zoom in a little bit on the scene, but I would argue that this is about the waterfalls. It is not so much about the blurry vegetation on the right. So let's try and get rid of that. And we can do that by creating a square crop here, or we turn it into a vertical. And we get rid of the vegetation on the left as well. Ross, come in a little bit more on the right and a little bit more on the left. Yeah, and now, okay, is that the best scene? Maybe not. Now we're losing a lot the water in the left, so I would turn this into a square crop. And you've already heard me refer a lot to square crop, standard to the 3 aspect ratio, and we've done a number of panoramic crops. We have standard aspect ratios in the studio. We use the squares, the 2x3, and we use a standard 6x17 for panoramic crops. So now I think we're getting a little bit closer to the water. The color looks a little bit funny, and I don't know if that's because of sedimentation in the river here. It also looks a little bit contrasty. It looks like it's a little bit blown out in the middle. I don't know if there's any detail left. I would consider a black and white conversion here. Okay, and now we have more opportunities to work with the grayscale in the middle. So I would kind of see, first of all, if there's more detail that can be brought into the highlights in the middle. And if there isn't, then we're going to start working with the gray tones, and we're going to start accentuating the blacks a little bit more. A little bit more contrast will bring out the swirl of water in the foreground. And Ross, can you toggle back and forth quickly between what we're looking at now and what we started with? So I think the patterns in the water are better expressed with this black and white. I think the photographer did a lot of things right. I like the shutter speed. I like the composition. The photographer just didn't go far enough with the essential components in his scene as I would like to focus it on. So I hope you'll have a chance to go back there and get a little bit closer still to those rapids. Now, at first glance, this looks like a scene from Zabriskie Point in Death Valley, but then when I look a little bit closer and when I looked at the metadata, it becomes clear that this is actually a mining site, and that turns it into a different subject. This is an industrial site. It has amazing possibilities for patterns, and if that is what the photographer was after, then I would suggest that we delete all references to the man-made components in the scene. You could argue that water tank in the extreme lower left, grounds the scene and gives us a sense of scale, but it is so far to the lower left that it almost is incidental. And I would suggest that we either back off a little bit and we see more references to a road or to vehicles or to a human presence, or that we go a little bit further into the abstraction. So we can't back up because this is the image that was delivered to us. So I would crop it in from the bottom right. Let's bring it in a little bit. So now stop right here. So now we have a really interesting scene, and then we can play a little bit with color and contrast. I would perhaps darken the that mass of yellow eroded hillside in the middle to bring it more in balance with the rest. Darken it a little bit, and then our eyes are a bit more drawn towards these wonderful blues and oranges. But mind you, when I say beautiful colors, at the same time, I'm not losing track of the fact that this is an industrial waste site. So I would encourage the photographer to go back and work more with the patterns in the scene, but also open up the view and turn it into a human scene as well. So two possibilities for strengthening the concept in either direction. This is an immaculately composed scene, beautifully executed. The file quality is amazing. From the derivative file that we received, I can't tell from the metadata which camera was used here, but it obviously involved a very long exposure. I can tell that from the way the water is turning into this milky substance in the foreground and in the middle ground. The photographer elected to keep the sky wide open, and I would like to see what happens if we darken the sky a little bit, because my eye keeps going to the lightest part in the image, and I would rather that my eyes are going to the water instead of escaping to the sky. And you see how Ross is applying a neutral density grad filter. Now you have to be a little bit careful with that. Ross is already using a brush to bring the white back into the lighthouse there. Well done, Ross. You need to do that very deftly. But now I think what we're beginning to see is some interesting banding in the sky that was there, but it was not fully expressed in the image as it was delivered to us. Now, I think we need to balance the sky a little bit more. It's becoming a little bit too dark in the upper left, so we have to work very carefully around the lighthouse, but you see where this is going. The bands in the sky are an integral part of the composition now, and they are a mirror of the way the water traces, the way it breaks on the shoreline here. And I like this version a little bit better. In order to do it justice, you have to spend quite a bit more time in development. But I think all the key ingredients are there. It just takes a little bit more time. Not sure where this image was made. This is not a landscape I immediately recognize, but really nice scene. What are the key ingredients? That's the question I always ask myself, and that is what I always ask of participants who join me on photo tours or on workshops. What is it that makes it interesting here? Well, obviously, the cascades in the water are a key part of this, but it's also the trees that are beginning to change color, that are lining the river, and then there's the peak in the distance and the trees in the middle. So there is a lot of interesting stuff going on here. Could we do better with the composition than the way the photographer has framed it? I think so, because now I'm beginning to look at what appears to be a roadway to the right or some man-made element. Now, I got nothing against man-made elements in landscapes, as I mentioned previously, but is it a key ingredient in this composition? I don't think so. Does that rock in the lower right need to be there? I don't think so. If the photographer had gone a little bit more to the right and made it a mirror shape to the peak, yes, then it could have worked out beautifully, but the photographer didn't do that. And then I'm looking at some tree branches that are sticking into the lower left. I don't think they need to be there either. So I would like to try and turn this into either a square or into a vertical and see if we can express the vision of the photographer more clearly. So let's start with the square crop, and then we can decide whether we want to go any further. Okay, let's lock this in. I think that this looks a little bit better to my eyes. Now we have a nice band of the water. We have a band with the trees. We have another band with the conifers going up the slope, and then it culminates in the peak in the top of the sky. We can process this a little bit different, but yeah. Have we lost a little bit too much of the water? Yeah, you could argue that. So let's go back to the original composition. Would there be another way to do this? Yes, but I would still argue that we get rid of that roadway or that concrete on the right. So in that case, it would mean coming in pretty hard. We'd either would have to become a panorama, but if we get Ross, let's crop it in from the center right. Okay, and you see we're going to lose things either way, or we have to turn this into extreme pano. Anyway, there are definitely options. And depending on what the photographer really favors, then we can work with that original concept and try to express it better. An urban scene. There are a lot of interesting options here, but what are those options and what are the key ingredients? Well, I think it's obviously the bridge, which is very graphic. We have buildings and construction cranes. There's an interesting relationship between the construction cranes and the bridge there in the middle, and then we have rocks in the foreground. But do those elements combine in the most optical way? I'm not so sure. I would have loved to see the photographer explore some other options. There are some real opportunities to play with the reflections of the bridge in the water, but here they are blocked by the rocks, and my instinct is to have gone a little bit further to the right, hop across the rocks there, and to see a little bit less of the rocks in the foreground, still use them as part of a way to anchor the foreground, but not make them as dominating as we are seeing here. Now, are there any other things that we are looking at here? Of course, that stormy sky. I forgot to look at that. That is also an interesting ingredient here, but they get lost a little bit behind the bridge here, and I think we would have seen a little bit more of that too if you could go a little bit more towards the water edge, because the clouds would have reflected better in the water that way. So, interesting attempt at processing this with some halftones. So there's definitely some interesting possibilities here. If this is your hometown photographer, I hope this will give you some ideas that you can go back to and play with the next time you can get there. Okay, what is interesting here is the foliage in the foreground, the foliage in the middle ground, and the rest is, I think, doesn't really relate as much. So I would like to get rid of the horizon here, and I would like to crop in from the top a little bit and turn it into more of a panorama. We don't need to see the sky. And now let's crop in from the bottom a little bit as well, and we can lock that in as a 6x17. Now I think this is an interesting combination of color and texture, and that can be processed a little bit more as well. Let's go on to the next one. This image has got some interesting qualities to it. We have a fisherman standing there. We have a lovely scene in that lake. The foliage is really, the trees are interesting, and we have a really interesting sky. But I think the photographer's gone too far with processing this. This doesn't look realistic anymore. So I would like to back off from the sky a great deal. But because we received a derivative JPEG, we can't really do much with that. So I would like to suggest that we convert this to a black and white. And now I think it begins to look a little bit more believable. The colors were over-processed. And then we level the shoreline there, and we crop in a little bit more on the figure so that he or she becomes a little bit more like that, and bingo. Now it looks better already, but there's a little bit too much drama in the sky there. So be careful with how far you go. You can do all these amazing things in Lightroom and in Photoshop, but don't go too far. Badlands. I love those landscapes, and there's a lot of eye candy here. There's lovely color, there's lovely texture, there's lovely shapes, interesting sky, but I think the photographer tried to take it all in, but didn't make enough of a decision about what the viewer should really be looking at. And I would like to see if we can make this a little bit more interesting by emphasizing those swirling lines of little streams in the foreground, and make that the lead into the rest of the landscape. So I would go for turning this into a vertical. So crop in from we need to keep the bottom because that's essential, and we crop in on the left and on the right. Now shift it a little bit to the right here. Now we need to go all the way to the bottom, Ross. Okay, now let's lock it in. So we could do more with this, but now I think these swirling diagonals are converging towards the center. They lead us into the composition. We really haven't lost any of the texture, but now that pale pink becomes more dominant, and it connects better with what we're seeing in the opposite hillside. So I think this is the essence of the scene. let's go to the next. I recognize this scene. This is in the eastern Sierra Nevada along 395, and a lot of photographers have been there. Now what makes this interesting? It's of course that arch and that effect of looking back at the Sierra Nevada through the arch, and then we have the God beams on the right hand side, and we have clouds. So really the scene is happening in the upper right quadrant, and therefore I would like to crop in pretty radically from the lower left. Yeah, I can appreciate that the photographer was trying to show the whole arch, but now I think the composition is a bit more balanced. I would go maybe just a touch more, but here you have it. Lovely black and white conversion, and more can be done there. Lovely gray tones. So I think this gets us a little bit closer to what we want to look at. Serene scene. Is this on the southeast coast of the United States? But it is, in my mind, it is really two scenes. I would either capitalize on the cloudscape, or I would capitalize on the dune grass in the foreground. So when you run a horizon right through the middle, it's usually it makes the viewer wondering, what is the most important part of the composition. So I would like to crop it up from the bottom, or I would like to crop it up from the top. And I really, all these cropping decisions I'm doing on the fly, and I hope I'm not being too rude to the photographers in question. I have to work with what I'm looking at here, but typically when I'm in a situation, in a landscape with someone else, these are the questions I ask is, what is the scene about? And then we can do the cropping in the camera. So now we've got an amazing cloudscape, and I think that's the most interesting part in the scene. Okay. I recognize this scene. This is the famous barn in near Jackson, Wyoming. Of course, there's only one place that looks like that. Those are the Grand Tetons. Often in landscape photography, what we need to do is start deleting things that are in our first composition. And in this case, does that old fence that is falling down have to be there? I don't think so. Yes, there's interesting shadows there, but if you want to work with the shadows, then you need to go a little bit to the right. I don't think that fence harmonizes very well with the barn and with the mountains. So I would like to go to a more panoramic rendition. So let's get rid of we leave the aspect ratio open, Ross. We don't crop in from the right. And we crop a little bit in from the top until we arrive at a 6x17. And now we have a classic scene with absolute pure white in the foreground, so there's nothing that obstructs the viewer from relishing in the texture of the barn and relishing in the texture of the Grand Tetons. Now you might say there's not much going on in and that this is a reject, but this is a very different kind of landscape than any of the others that my eyes were drawn to. And this is more reminiscent of the more impressionistic kind of landscape photography that is practiced in Northern Europe, in the Scandinavian countries, and in Central European countries like Hungary, where people are a bit more impressionistic in the way they work with light, in the way they work with shapes. And even though the specifics are barely there, it looks like a blurry scene with some reeds and some water reflections. I think there's some interesting ingredients to play with in Lightroom. So what I would do is try to separate the colors a little bit more. Look at the blues, look at the yellows, maybe increase contrast a little bit to get a little bit more of the blurry shapes of the reeds out. Maybe crop in from the top a little bit because that band of water doesn't need to extend that far in the upper part of the frame. And now a lot of you who are specific landscape photographers are saying, what is Frans looking at? I would throw this image away. Fine, be my guest. But I do want to emphasize that I always start with what the maker of an image may have had in mind and work with the good elements and see if we can extract and express the vision a little bit more than what the photographer may have done initially. So we can go a bit more we can play more with color. It's up to you to decide whether you still consider this a reject or a starting point for more creative landscape photography. Let's go on to the next one. This looks like a scene from the Potomac River. This is a very specific landscape. What is this about? Is it about the rapids? Is it about the rapids and the rocks? Is it about the vegetation, or is it about the sky? I would argue that the photographer has not made up his or her mind with respect to what we should be looking at. I would consider that the sky is the least interesting part of this scene, so I would like to take it out completely. Ross, let's bring the horizon down all the way. We leave the aspect ratio. Okay. So now let's go into this. I think this looks a lot more interesting. Now the file begins to fall apart a little bit. I'm seeing some pixelation. But now I see a lot more eye candy. I'm much closer to the rapids, and we could crop in more, but I would really suggest to the photographer to take this as a starting point and go back in there with a longer lens, and then to start playing with different compositions that show a balance between water and rocks. Okay? Now, this is an interesting scene, and some of you photographers who submitted images gave me more to work with than the image in question by providing some background about the location and what went through your mind. I can really begin to interact with you remotely, and that helps a lot. If I don't know anything about you and your intentions, then it is a little bit difficult to get into your head, so to speak. So in this case, the photographer explained that a couple of times a year there's these lovely light patterns where the light breaks into different elements of the color spectrum. And when I know that, then I say, that is what the image is all about. So it's not about the branches in the foreground. It's not about the big trees. So for that reason, I would like to get closer to that color spectrum. So Ross, let's start by cropping up from the bottom. Okay, and now we move the scene to yes. Let's get radical here. the image quality begins to fall apart a little bit, and I really like the tree on the left as a way to frame this, so let's back out a little bit. So and I like the grasses in the foreground. Okay, let's move the scene to the right a little bit. Okay, a little bit more. Yeah, try it like that. Now, I think that the trees are framing the composition better, but we are a little bit closer to those interesting bands of color. Now, I would like to know more from the photographer, what the true original colors were, and that is why I like to look at raw files when we do our virtual workshops. And there's one coming up this winter. We ask participants to deliver raw files, and then we go into a dialogue, and then we can go much further with optimizing the image possibilities. But really interesting situation, and I hope you have a chance to go back there when you can express the same interesting atmospherics. Wow, this is really very nice. I love looking at this here. This is a creative way to deal with trees in a forest. And I mentioned something earlier about Scandinavian landscape photography, and that is where photographers have gone very far with these kind of impressions. And how you can achieve them is by putting your camera on a tripod, and then in the course of a long shutter speed you move the camera up or down, and you arrive at impressions of trees. And I like the way those aspen trees are mirrored here in the water. Everything about this resonates with me, but that's just the way I like to look at shapes and color. This is beautifully done. Picture perfect. I recognize this scene. I've been there myself. There's only one place that I know of where you can see this, and that is in the magnificent massive sand dunes in northern Namibia, where oryx has come across. I think that if we analyze this scene, it's about the sand dunes and it's about the oryx. Do we need to see these remnants of vegetation in the foreground? Do we need to see that vegetated sand dune in the extreme left? I don't think so. So let's get rid of the bottom part of this. We turn this into a more extreme pano. Ross, let's not crop anything from the left or the right. We get rid of the bottom part. Okay. Now we lock this in, and we turn it into a 6x7. No, this is fine. Now let's darken the image a little bit, because it looks a little bit pale. And now the sand dunes begin to live a little bit more. There's a lot of things that can be done here. We can express the yellows better, the lovely mauves. This image was made probably in early morning, and that is when you can get that really beautiful tonality between highlights and shadows. This could make an interesting black and white conversion as well. So lots of possibilities. But I really would like to stick with this aspect ratio. Now I'm beginning to see the shadows of the gemsbok's head and the horns reflected in the sand dunes as well. Lots of eye candy. Kudos to the photographer. Now, that was the last image in question. So please stay in touch with us. Follow me via all these social media platforms. And if you want to consider joining us for a virtual workshop session, here's where you can find us. And please join us next week when I do a new keynote talk for the OPTIC's All Masters series of programs hosted by B&H. Thank you for joining me here, and we look forward to your comments. Bye-bye.
That was great, Franz, and that was an amazing section of images. You really put your all into the crit. We are in extreme overtime, so I'm just going to just say one question that really came up that seemed to be redundant. Everyone was asking, and that's the same thing from last week. And it's your cropping really helped out the photographs. How can we, in terms of how much do we know to crop versus how much megapixel the image, how much meat is on the bone of the image before we start to overcrop and run into a risk of overcropping in relation to the image size?
Well, I think that's a really good question, David. And I mentioned it in the course of the image review that uh, the suggested crops are really a way for me to give feedback to the photographers to help them refine their vision while they're standing there. Because I know that in quite a few situations, the photographer chose a scene that is pretty close to where he or she is living. And, you can't go back to Antarctica so easily. So that is where you have to do cropping after the fact. But really, my overriding recommendation to people is to think more clearly about what are the key ingredients in a landscape image as you're looking at the scene overall. And typically, you can make improvements on the spot by cropping. If you use a zoom lens, you use that lens on the spot, or if you don't have a zoom lens, you use your feet to crop, right? It's all about your vantage point. Uh, Often you need to be closer to the key ingredients in a scene. Sometimes you need to back off a little bit, but usually you can make some improvements in your original vision by thinking more carefully about what it is that your eyes are drawn to.
That's exactly that's it. The spirit of the landscape. Okay, so thank you very much again, Franz and the team out there in California, and I want to thank our team here in New York City, and then mostly I want to thank everyone who submitted photos or who watched and hopefully gained some expertise. This was, as I said, number 2 of our 2-part critique series with Frans Lanting. Frans had thrown up his information for further information on his workshops and for working with Frans further. And we'll see everyone at 10 a.m. Eastern Time this Sunday, November 22nd, for OPTIC All-Stars. And you can go to opticallstars.com. We'll be sending out more links from Eventbrite on this, and really looking forward to it. And thank you very much, everybody. See you soon.
Bye bye. Thanks for joining.